In the previous video, we talked about social judgment theory and how for any topic there are a wide range of possible opinions or positions a person can hold. And we learned that you and Uncle Ted, who never seem to agree on anything, hold different anchor positions about what the appropriate punishment for murder is. But hang on just a minute, because the anchor position is not the only position a person might find acceptable. Let's consider three additional parts of social judgment theory: latitude of acceptance, latitude of rejection, and latitude of non-commitment. First, even though we have a preferred anchor position about most topics, most of us also have what's called a latitude of acceptance, which includes statements and ideas with which we agree. So even though Uncle Ted's anchor position is that murderers should be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, he's also okay with murderers being sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. And he's also okay with murderers being sentenced to death as humanely as possible. When you think about the statements about punishing murderers that you agree with, you discover you share some common ground with Uncle Ted. Because your latitude of acceptance includes life in prison with the possibility of parole, and you could even envision agreeing to life without the possibility of parole under certain circumstances. Hey, maybe you and Uncle Ted belong to the same family after all. Now let's think about that second concept, the things we could never agree with, which fall into our latitude of rejection. Uncle Ted, for example, could never agree with anything less than 20 years in prison as a punishment for murder. And even your Uncle Ted rejects the idea that death by torture is an appropriate punishment in the United States of America. He's kind of meh on the idea of 20 or more years in prison, though, so that punishment falls into Uncle Ted's latitude of non-commitment. Finally, we have one last concept to think about, and that's the degree of ego involvement we have with an issue. Basically, if a person feels the issue is highly relevant to their self-concept and self-esteem, then they have a high level of ego involvement. And if the person's ego is highly involved, they will be very difficult to persuade. On the other hand, if a person doesn't feel very connected to an issue, they're likely to have a low level of ego involvement, and they may be easier to persuade. So on the issue of the appropriate punishment for someone who has committed murder, both you and Uncle Ted are lucky not to personally know anyone who has committed murder, and neither of you personally know anyone who's been a victim of murder. So on this issue, neither you nor Uncle Ted feel highly ego involved, and that's probably why you both have fairly wide latitudes of acceptance about what an appropriate punishment would be. This is a topic you and your uncle can discuss at Thanksgiving without getting all hot and bothered. But when you think about it, both you and Uncle Ted are highly ego involved in the Confederate flag issue, and that's probably why you're having a hard time understanding each other. On this issue, you're both going to have to work hard to understand where the other is coming from. And that's social judgment theory.
Created using Powtoon.